If everyone can take their seats, we're going to get started. So this is going to be a really great session. I'm really pleased to be moderating the session on epidemiology through the lens of journal editors. So as you saw from the sessions yesterday and then all of our small group sessions this morning, a key focus of the symposium is on communication. Right, and thinking about how we communicate not just inwardly, not just to each other, but taking that outward perspective of how we communicate to others outside of our field and how epidemiology is perceived by the other relevant stakeholders. And no one's really more critical to that discussion than the editors of scientific journals. So yesterday, Brian shared some great examples of conversations going on in our field, in journals, some in Twitter, some just casual conversations, some reflecting on the different tensions that we feel within our field, even when it comes to securing funding and whether we can use the name epidemiology when we're looking at certain funding sources. Many of us have had similar conversations like that about what gets published in high-impact journals. And specifically how some epidemiologic work, maybe work that's more descriptive, may be of a lower priority in some settings. So I look forward to talking about some of these challenges, some of the tensions that we face today. So we have actually the great pleasure of having two editors of the leading journals of epidemiology here with us as well. So we heard from Moises Sklo, who's the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Epidemiology yesterday. We also have in our audience Alan Wilcox, who's the editor-in-chief of Epidemiology. And while we look forward to you being a part of this conversation, we very deliberately opted to have on our panel outward journal editors from the broader medical and scientific readership, just to, again, get outside of our comfort zone and think about that outward-facing perception so that we can continue to have this conversation about how we might have impact. So we have a fantastic group from some obscure journals that you may have heard of. So I'm going to introduce each of them now, and then they'll each give a brief perspective on the context of epidemiology in their journal before we start the discussion. Now, this is meant to be an interactive session, so start thinking about the questions that you have for them, everything except why didn't you publish my paper in your journal? No, I can imagine. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction. So Sonia Schmidt, so actually let me start from this way down. So Dr. Rebecca Cooney is the North American executive editor of the Lancet, and she also writes and records for the Lancet United States of Health blog. Prior to this appointment, she was an editor at Medscape and the New York Academy of Medicine. She has a PhD in psychology from Stanford University and completed her postdoctoral training at Columbia. Next to her is Christine Lane, who has been the editor-in-chief of the Annals of Internal Medicine since 2009. She joined the journal originally in 1995 as an associate editor, then became the deputy editor, then the senior deputy editor. Dr. Lane is actually a practicing physician in Philadelphia, and she received her medical degree from the State University of New York at Stony Brook. She also holds an MPH from Harvard with concentration in quantitative methods and epidemiology. Next to her is Sonia Schmidt, who's an associate editor for Nature Communications, and she handles manuscripts in virology, parasitology, including research on all aspects of pathogen-host interactions, development of vaccines, therapeutics, and epidemiology in clinical medicine. Just wanted to give you a sense of how broad that she was. Dr. Schmidt has been in this role since May of 2016. She holds an MS in biology and a PhD in virology and molecular biology, both from the University of Freiburg. And then finally, Dr. Brad Weibel is a senior commentary editor for policy and education at Science Magazine. He obtained his Bachelor's of Science from Drexel University and a PhD in neuroscience from Northwestern University. He's been involved in science policy at the NIH, the AAAS, university administration at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. So you can see even their training comes from a broad perspective. So we really look forward to hearing your thoughts today. Thank you. So we're going to start with Rebecca Cooney.
Do we use the clicker?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, I'm Rebecca Cooney. I usually go by Beck, so feel free to call me that.
I am with the Lancet, and I'm totally delighted to be here with you today. This was actually a really fun project to think about epidemiology through our journal, and sort of broaden my own thinking about what, my sort of preconceived notions about what epidemiology is. Let me make sure I'm going the correct way. And just before I begin too, I called this There and Back Again, not just to be really cutesy, but then yesterday, as I was on the train down here, I realized that I had forgotten my wallet, so I had to actually go, and now I'm here back again with you. So it'll come full circle. So the Lancet, and of course, let's start by feting Johns Hopkins I'll have us talk about ourselves a little bit. So the Lancet has been around for a while, and you can see in the last, couple hundred years, things have really sort of exploded in terms of the breadth and scope of our journal family. And, one thing that I like to talk about in this context is that you don't stick around this long without adapting, and you don't stick around this long without being responsive to researchers and the community, and to see how you need to sort of change to meet their needs. And so just some notable things, we started Lancet Public Health very recently, and that has done very well. That's an open access journal. Lancet Global Health just celebrated its 5th anniversary, which is very exciting, and we now have e-biomedicine and e-clinical medicine and a few more on the way. So we're always sort of figuring out where we're going next and how are we going to work with authors to do that. So reflecting a bit on how epidemiology is important in that thought is really, I think that the development of our journal family mirrors the coevolution of academic epidemiology. And really two of our kind of most stalwart partners in that have been Johns Hopkins and the London School. And being that they both started around the same time, I think it's really fun to think about how, 100 years ago, that the people who were here would have probably been reading the Lancet and working together there. But also, we think of it as a sort of a larger relationship that we have as partners in how to represent the work that you're doing. And we also consider it really foundational to our idea of the best science for better lives. So really, it's fundamentally the work that you're doing as a way to promote health. So even though this doesn't map perfectly onto the same 100-year epic, because I can't think into the future about what we'll be publishing in 2019, I figured I'd just keep it to this day, 100 years ago, what people would be reading the Lancet. And I would just briefly draw your attention to some alcohol work, a little bit of tuberculosis in people who are migrating. We've got the influenza epidemic. We have some letters to the editor about vaccination scheduling, and poliovirus, and looking at under 5 years old deaths. So nothing that would be relevant to now, for example. So it's just fascinating to think and to look back on this. So these are not just from today, but from this year. But this is across Lancet Respiratory Medicine, Lancet Global Health. We have a Lancet Commission on Tuberculosis. This very impactful paper, epi paper on alcohol consumption this year. World Reports on Polio. So so we're going there and back again, I think, in the same areas that are of interest, are still of interest today. It's just how we're approaching those problems. I'd also draw your attention to, this is a really neat kind of retrospective of the of papers and work from the Lancet over the last 100 years just around the influenza pandemic. So it's a really kind of neat historical perspective to kind of walk through all that. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the importance of the global burden of disease study. That has been probably one of the bulwarks of the epidemiology work that we've contributed, I think, to the space in the last 10 years. And since 1997, you can see this proliferation, and we now have these giant comprehensive studies from 2010 through 2016. And then, but we've also reflected across the family of journals, have publications in some of these other areas. So there's a breadth now in what that represents. Another question that we were asked is what we'd like to see in the future and see more of. And I think of them as sort of complementary questions. And I think, very importantly, so epigenetics and epigenomics, this is increasingly more important. We see way more submissions on these topics. But we don't want to lose the forest for the trees. And really, one of the most important things when we're evaluating papers is thinking about the broader context of that and what are the environmental and social factors that have an effect on those. And so even though we definitely encourage work in this area, thinking about how to best situate it so that it does actually improve health. Big data and precision medicine, equally similar situations where we want to have authors highlight the clinical utility and the salience for us. But another area that I think is really important and that we are personally working our best to help promote is to make sure that we have better gender representation both in authors and reviewers and in the published manuscripts, and also to better represent the global South. So I kind of consider these three areas where we're actively working with you and observing and seeing where things are going. I'd also like to reflect on the fact that epidemiology has really guided some of the other valuable work that we have contributed to. In 2003, the Child Survival Series was published with Bob Black, and the backstory of this is the Lancet lore, is that he and other researchers who are working in this space were just so concerned about, the lack of advancement, even though we knew that child mortality was just staying flat. So how do we use that science that we have to actually come up with actionable conclusions? And so this was sort of the foundation of what our modern commissions are, and so something that we've been doing increasingly more of, and that we've really partnered with Johns Hopkins to do that. And so finally, just because I think it's such a monumental thing to sort of pat yourselves on the back and kind of reflect and look back on 100 years of good work, and so just to keep the theme in there, you guys can be Thorin and Lancet will be Gandalf. So we'd like to look behind in the nick of time to kind of figure out where we're going next. So I'll thank you and stop there.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about annals. I like doing that a lot. I can't advance the slides. All right, here, I got it. So the panel's assignment, you know a little bit about this from Beck's discussion. This is the assignment that Brian sent. Why is epidemiology important to your journal? What role has epidemiology played in your journal? What role do you see epidemiology filling for the future? And what would you like to see more of from the field of epidemiology? In answering these questions, I talked to some of my members of my editorial team, so it represents some of my thoughts and some of the thoughts really from the people who make the journal happen. So this is a definition of epidemiology from Wikipedia, the most authoritative source in the world these days. And you can read that definition. But when I was, during my general medicine fellowship, and I was going to get a master's in epidemiology, my mother asked, what I said I was going to get a master's degree, and she asked what it was in, and I said epidemiology, and she said, "When did you become interested in diseases caused by bugs?" So I had to explain, like we did this morning, a lot of the same conversation about what exactly is epidemiology. A little bit about annals, because that'll help tie the answers to these questions together. So we're owned and published by 1927 by the American College of Physicians. So it's the biggest professional organization of physicians in the US. We're the most cited internal medicine journal in the world. Our last impact factor was 19.384, and we all know the problems with the impact factor, but that has to be mentioned. We get over 3,500 submissions per year, and we publish only about 5% of the original research that we get. 40% of our annals.org visitors and 40% of our submissions come from outside North America. So even though we're owned by the American College of Physicians, we really are a global journal. We publish articles weekly online, and then we archive them in a print issue. And we have over 1 million visitors to annals.org, our electronic journal, each month. And in 2017, we had 3.8 billion media impressions. So that means that 3.8 billion pairs of eyes or ears heard a general media story about something published in Annals. So our audience goes really beyond our academic readers to the general public, and that's another sort of accountability that we have. This is our mission: to promote excellence in medicine, enable physicians and other healthcare professionals to be well-informed members of the medical community and society, to advance standards in the conduct and reporting of medical research, and contribute to improving the health of people worldwide. So, pretty heavy mission statement, and one that I think we would be unable to do if we didn't publish epidemiology research. So why is epidemiology important to Annals of Internal Medicine? Well, Annals readers, our core readership, who are clinicians, are interested in the impact of healthcare practices and public policies on populations as well as on individuals. And you need epidemiology to answer those questions. And epidemiologic methods are really the most feasible way to explore many of the questions that patients, clinicians, policymakers, and the public need answered in today's day and time, as it was 100 years ago when the school started. And a large proportion of the original research that we publish in Annals is observational research that could fall under the umbrella of epidemiology. This is just a sample of a couple of studies we published this last year that I think fall under the umbrella of epidemiology: hot tea consumption and esophageal cancer, and hot tea consumption and tobacco and esophageal cancer, HIV viral suppression trends over time. Really, in the world of HIV, I think one of our real success stories of what epidemiologists can do to improve health outcomes for people: smoking and lung cancer, chronic pain among suicide victims, and the comparative effectiveness of the safety of different bariatric procedures. So a real spectrum of things that look at health behaviors, at social issues, and at infectious agents, and at interventions for chronic diseases like obesity. So what role has epidemiology played for Annals? I think, as I've mentioned, epidemiology is really integral in fulfilling the journal's mission, which is to promote excellence in medicine. People need to understand about the behaviors and the policy and the interventions and how they affect outcomes, to practice excellent medicine, and to be well informed. And epidemiology, another one of our missions is to advance standards in the conduct and reporting of medical research, and epidemiologists are the people that are contributing many of those methods in conjunction with their biostatistical and clinical colleagues. And without epidemiology, it would be really hard to contribute to improving the health of people worldwide. This is just a list of our Annals editorial staff, and all the people in red would describe themselves as epidemiologists. So we have, there are people that are biostatisticians and epidemiologists, clinicians and epidemiologists, people that are just epidemiologists at various master's and PhD levels. So there's quite a few of us on the masthead. What would we like to see more of in the field of epidemiology? I think that we would like to see more scholarly work to develop and improve upon analytic methods that help us better understand the limits and the implications of findings from epidemiology studies. We'd like to see more methodological rigor in epidemiologic studies related to nutrition and also things like social policies around opioid misuse, firearm injury, and to address things like confounding and measurement error and competing risks. And as analytic methods mature and improve, we'd like to see people not rely on things that they did in studies a decade ago, but to use the more contemporary methods. And we'd like to see more tools to educate non-epidemiologists. This goes very much to how we spent in my group talking about this morning, who are at the front line of clinical care and policymaking, better understand the potential advances and the limits that epidemiologic studies can provide, and to even know what an epidemiologist is, because my non-physician mother is certainly not alone in thinking that maybe we study diseases caused by bugs. So this is an example of a study we published recently that looks at the E-value, so a methodology, a tool to look at what is the potential impact of confounding in an observational study. It's gotten a lot of attention, and some of the people who have spoke negatively of it want to harken back to old methods and focus on the limitations of this method rather than the potential. But I think we do, as we are getting more complicated studies, more complicated data, we do need to improve the tools that we're using. And this is an example of a series that we're doing. These papers are all written by some of our statistical editors about understanding clinical research. This is not focused on the people doing the research so much, but on the people who are reading the research and integrating it into their professional activities. And these papers are short. They're about under 2,000 words, and they focus on one small issue and use examples of studies that we've published in the journal to walk the reader through things. So it's understanding p-values, understanding missing data, understanding risk estimates in meta-analyses and things like that. We'd like to see more work like this, translating methods into language that non-methodologists can understand. What role does Anil see epidemiology filling for the future? Well, we do have this tsunami of big data, and some of that big data is genetic data. And I think that epidemiologists are going to be really important in understanding both the data, the big data that's accumulated as people live their lives, and identify ways to improve health outcomes, use those data to identify ways to improve health outcomes of both individuals and populations, and also to understand the tsunami of genetic data that's quickly increasing, and whether and how we can use those data to improve, to identify risks of disease that are clinically relevant and actionable. I think those are going to be big challenges, and I think that within it's going to be a multidisciplinary effort, but I think that epidemiologists are going to be really critical in making the links there between the data and health. And these are just some commentaries based about those issues that we've published recently. So I will end there, and I think we'll take questions later. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here and learn from all of you, how are you about the epidemiology field, how you see yourself, and where you see the field going or where it should be moving in the future. So I'm a senior editor with Nature Communications. I handle manuscripts in the area of epidemiology of infectious diseases and also other aspects of infectious diseases. And yeah, that we already saw what the organizers gave us as a task. And so I'm going to try to answer these questions from the perspective of nature communications. And so why is epidemiology important to us, to my journal? And I think to answer this question, I should take a step back and quickly introduce the journal to you. So Nature Communications, what we want to do is we want to communicate significant and impactful advances in any branch of science. In terms of communicate, we are an open access journal, which means for the researcher that your research is highly visible. Anybody can access it. That includes other researchers, that includes teachers maybe that want to use it for teaching, policymakers, and the general public. When I say any branch of science, I pretty much mean any branch of science. So we have life sciences and physical sciences. We also have editors now for social sciences. So we literally cover astronomy to zoology. It also means that we cover basic translational and clinical research. And while it is definitely not a prerequisite to have an interdisciplinary approach in your research, I think the journal might be a good space for such interdisciplinary research that might fall through the cracks at other journals because it's out of scope, doesn't quite fit. And why are we interested in epidemiology? As I said, we want to publish and communicate impactful science. And I think epidemiology is that. So one aspect of it is that it helps to understand factors underlying health and disease, and then in the long term, it impacts policy making and it affects people's lives. So if, as a journal, we can help to communicate such research that in the long term affects people's lives, that's great. That's what we want to do. And yeah, you already saw that mentioned yesterday. So this year in May, I think we published an editorial to explain or to give the field an idea of what we think about epidemiology, or tell you that we think epidemiology is important and that we are interested in publishing papers from your field. What role has epidemiology played in your journal so far? So I'm going to give you a few examples that fit broadly into epidemiology, but as we are currently not recognized, I think, by the epidemiology field as a journal that you would send your papers to, I don't think we have many papers that really fit the core definition of epidemiology. So those are some examples of papers that we published. So we published quite a lot of papers in the realm of genetic epidemiology, so GWAS or similar approaches to mainly in the cancer field, so to associate genes with cancer. Another area where we already publish papers is genomic epidemiology, so in the infectious disease field. So this particular paper followed Shigella in England and in France and looked at the impact of horizontal and vertical transfer of resistance. We also publish a lot in infectious disease epidemiology and spatial modeling. So this particular paper looked at malaria dissemination in Madagascar and identified sinks and sources in the country and how malaria is transmitted. And so this is a paper that loosely connects maybe to clinical epidemiology. So what they did, they used a smaller cohort where they had SNPs and biomarkers. And from this, they, let's say, extrapolated the data and connected it with a huge cohort to be able to associate biomarkers with phenotypes, like in larger cohorts. To look more into the future, So what role do I see epidemiology filling in the future at our journal? For me, that's an easy question to answer. I hope an increasing role, because, as I said, we don't publish that much in epidemiology at the moment. So to give you a rough idea, like a large field like cancer-related research makes up about 10% of our content in 2018, very roughly. A smaller field like parasitology makes up maybe around 1%, but epidemiology is like still even below that. And we would like to change that. Also, at the moment, we only get like certain types of epidemiology studies. So this is mainly genetic epidemiology, and in that area, mainly in the cancer field. And then the other area is infectious disease epidemiology, and here it's mainly modeling and genomics. But what we really would like to do in the journal at Nature Communications is like to publish papers that reflect the diversity of the field, like to really cover the whole field, so which means we are lacking other diseases and conditions other than cancer. We are lacking studies that look more at environmental and socioeconomic factors in contrast to genetic factors. And also many approaches like trials and observational studies, we don't get currently submissions in that area. So all these areas we would like to improve and like publish more. And I think that was it, yes. Thank you.
And this thing right here? How's everybody doing today? Thanks so much, and happy birthday. This is the first and probably the only time I'll ever be at a birthday party for a centenarian, so let's enjoy the moment. And what a tremendous first couple talks. Thanks so much. I think one of the curses of going last is that everyone's already said so many of the awesome things that you wanted to say, but I think that's reassuring to all of us. And if we, being epidemiologists, if we were to do a meta-analysis of the presentations, we could extract some very strong signals from what we're doing here. So, so thanks again. So this exercise gave me a good incentive to sort of look back through the beauties of Wikipedia and find out, what is 100 years? What was happening 100 years ago in Baltimore? And so for a room full of epidemiologists, I don't need to tell you that Baltimore and a lot of the world is being ravaged by flu 100 years ago today. And thankfully, a lot of good people, physicians, nurses, researchers, students at Johns Hopkins were part of the fight to mitigate and help people. A few miles that way, south across the water, the grounds at Fort McHenry were turned into a giant hospital. People were just dropping like flies. It was horrible. And so this got me thinking, what was Science Magazine doing 100 years ago? And funnily enough, thank you, Internet. 100 years ago yesterday, page 1 above the fold, George Soper, who it turns out I read was credited with discovering Typhoid Mary in New York many, many years ago, published a preliminary documentation of influenza in army camps. And so does epidemiology have a home at Science Magazine? Well, it did 100 years ago, and I'm here to tell you, I think it does today. But despite this, during my preparation for this, I was talking to some external people to see what they think about people who know the field and know the journal. What do they think? And one gentleman by the name of Chris Dye, who's a big tuberculosis researcher, used to be at the WHO for many years until recently, he said, science is a very good fit for epidemiology, but that is not sufficiently appreciated by the epidemiology and public health community. So that was his opinion as someone who sort of knows both sides of the fence. You can agree or disagree with that. But in any case. So we've been asked to respond to a few questions. And like I said, I've discussed with several of my editorial colleagues at the journal and with a few external people to get their thoughts. And I'm going to do my best to try and convey what we've collectively come up with and sort of channel interesting stuff. Full disclosure, I'm not an epidemiologist, and I'm not the primary editor who handles stuff there. But what I have in my favor is that I live by the Homewood campus 5 miles away, and the infectious disease editor is in the UK, so here I am. But all jokes aside, I'm the primary point of contact for a lot of our policy commentary and opinion pieces, and no surprise to you, a few of those managed to touch on a lot of the topics that we cared deeply about. So anyway, I'm going to do my best to channel what these other experts have conveyed to me, and we'll see where we go. And again, I would like to go out on a limb and think that I speak for all of us here. A huge part of our job as editors is not just to lock the doors in some tower and reject people's papers. We're scientists. We're part of a community here. And so our job is to get out here and see what the community wants and needs and how to do better. And so as I go through my pitch here, I just want you to be thinking, well, you know what, Brad, that's kind of crappy. And so I'm going to tell you about it. And that's my job. And if we're doing something right, let us know. So please, we're all in this together. Real quickly, I want to say a few things just about our publisher and who we are and why we do what we do, so that I think it could help you appreciate why I think we're a little bit unique and why we do what we do and why you might want to work with us. So our publisher is the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So that American is kind of an artifact from when we were founded in 1848. We are a global society, a nonprofit scientific membership society, and we span every discipline of science with a great many members around the world and partnerships with societies. And so what does that mean? Why should you care? Well, when you're supporting Science Magazine, you're also supporting this membership nonprofit society that does a lot to promote the interest of the scientific community and to help promote science for broader social benefits. So we have a lot of effort looked at bridging science and public policy and education, a lot of efforts in diversity in the workforce, et cetera, et cetera. You can see it right there. So anyway, that's part of what makes us who we are. Now, Science Magazine, again, Science Magazine, I guess, was celebrating its 38th birthday when the epidemiology department was formed. We started up with some money from this guy named Thomas Edison. And so that's, I'm fortunate to inherit a legacy, and, all of us editors wake up every day saying, we don't want to be the one to drive it in the ditch. And so we're trying to keep a good thing going. But Science Today, again, we're weekly, crushing weekly deadlines every week of the year. We're a hybrid, research papers, but also we have our own in-staff news writers. And like I said, I do a lot of commentary and analysis pieces spanning all fields of research, from paper to paper, but even within papers. And we have some circulation and following numbers there. So again, it's a good place. I think we prioritize not just good research, but helping authors polish and refine the work, doing all we can to sort of promote and get the word out there. So anyway, I show this to you for a reason. This is sort of a breakdown, as of a few years ago, what we publish, vaguely. And the reason I do it is this. Every week, we editors have what we call the space meeting. It has nothing to do with astronauts. It has to do with space in the magazine. And it's where we go and say, this is this exciting work I have. And then an editor in a completely different field says, oh, yeah, well, I have a better paper. And so it's a fight. So not only do you have to compete and say, oh, I'm the best work in my discipline, and say, yeah, but are you the Higgs boson? And you say, well, I don't know. So that's part of when you get these letters from the journal, with the bad news, it's one of those things like, it's not you, it's us. We're trying to fit a lot of things in here, and sometimes we need to publish the Higgs boson. So anyway, but actually, we didn't publish the Higgs boson. What am I saying? Okay, so, because that was like publication by press release, I think was that one. Anyway, so now, like I said, I'm going to try and channel what some of my colleagues and external people conveyed to me. So, and again, a lot of this will seem familiar based on what you've heard before. So, I know that one editor in particular handles a lot of, infectious disease modeling papers, and also we're a scientific research journal, and so you can learn a lot from these models that it raises questions that you might not otherwise really consider, and you can shed a lot of light on, fundamental mechanisms of ecology and evolution. I was talking with Brian before the session here about the reproducibility crisis, and I know that that's something that a lot of people are concerned about. It. No, there's a lot of different answers to it, but bringing some good, rigorous analytical and design practices to the table can only help as we try and solve that and sort that out. Again, echoing the big data wave, yeah, it's everywhere, and so just because it's big data doesn't mean it's good data, and how do we separate the wheat from the chaff? Okay. Apologies, I don't know if that's remotely readable, but anyway, I thought, what role has epidemiology played in science? Well, I asked people to give me some titles here, and so we tend to skew lately towards epidemiology of infectious disease and modeling, but we do touch on some other topics. There's a type 2 diabetes and obesity paper there. And these are all based on just the past few years of some research papers and a few literature review articles. But we also, like I said, we do some commentary and opinion pieces like this one at the bottom that had some authors from Hopkins that we just published. We also have our news staff does a phenomenal job of covering these topics. So, could we do more and could we do different? Absolutely. But I think there's a strong case to be made that we're a good, viable home for some of your best research. A paper on drug overdose epidemics. So there you go. What role in the future? If anyone has a big checkbook and would like to start writing checks, of course we would like more, 30, 40, 50, 60-year-long, Framingham studies so that we can unlock the mysteries of all these other horrible diseases. Antimicrobial resistance is, I don't know about you guys, but I hear a lot more about a lot of problems like climate change, which is admittedly a good problem, but not as many people are marching in the streets about antimicrobial resistance, and I kind of think we should be, but we're trying to do our part to put that out there. Of course, emerging infectious diseases are going to be a core area going forward. I thought this was interesting. Effects of demographic transition. Societies are, many societies are getting a whole lot older, and what kind of massive restructuring and destabilizing influences is going to happen. I think the impacts of climate change, we're just starting to scratch the surface of what's going to happen there, and epidemiology certainly is going to have to play a role to play as environments change and as people move to new environments and cultures and communities clash, and of course, using epidemiological tools to look at a lot of things like obesity, guns, drugs. What would we like to see from epidemiology? I think, we're all wrestling with this. A lot of populations aren't as well represented in studies as they should be, and there's a lot of room to improve. So how can we all as a community get on top of that and improve? Again, climate change, capacity building. I know there's a lot of tremendous efforts to do this, but still, we probably are more, there's a lot of papers from a lot of parts in the world that have authors based in Baltimore writing about places far away, and fewer of the people who live there are the ones leading the studies. And we're all committed and we're aware of that, but there's still a lot of work to be done. I think there's efforts made to increase the representation of all sorts of communities and populations in the studies and see how that impacts the findings and interpretations of what we're doing. I think we were talking about this also beforehand. Open data is a big thing, but negative data. Throughout the history of humankind and certainly science and research, the vast amount of learning arguably happens in failed things that never get published. And how do we capture that and stop making the same mistakes again and again and again? I don't have an answer, but it's something we need to be thinking about. So I'm going to stop there. That's me in the bottom right, and then these are my colleagues. Should you want to pester them or reach out to them and pitch them an idea, they'd be more than happy to hear from you. So thanks a lot, and happy birthday again.
presentations. And Sonia, I think you're going to see an increase in these submissions, particularly to your journal. Please, the panel's open for questions. There are microphones on the left and the right. While people come up, I can just start. I think a couple of you raised in presentations, particularly Christine and Brad, this sort of the need for methodologic, we all did, the need for methodologic rigor, using advanced methods, modeling, and we've talked a lot about this tension between kind of the simple methods versus the more complicated. Sometimes there's a need, sometimes there's not, but then in this world where things get distilled down to these very brief messages and sound bites, and you talked about the consumers of the work from the journals, what is our role? What can we do better to ensure that these findings when they get communicated in these brief ways are conveyed appropriately rather than, when you can't necessarily include all the complexity. And I think, Christine, you gave some nice examples of those short pieces that people are doing in the annals about methods, but are there other things that we should be doing?
I guess I'll start.
Yeah.
So at Annals, we have a T-shirt that says, Annals of Internal Medicine, statistics means never having to say you're certain. And we made it as a joke for our sort of staff, but I think communicating that, people are very uncomfortable with uncertainty. Patients are uncomfortable with it, clinicians are uncomfortable with it, policymakers, the general public. But I think communicating the fact that evidence is incremental. There are very few studies, if any, out there that in a flash just change what we do. Trying to communicate that uncertainty, even though we're uncomfortable with it. But it's very hard. We spend a lot of time. Eliseo Guayar, who's in the audience, was a statistician on 2 papers on coffee and mortality that we published in Annals, and we worked with the authors to make their message really being drinking more coffee is not going to make you live longer, but there doesn't seem to be any ill health effects from it. But when that got out into the world, it was drink 6 cups of coffee, live forever. At least you'll be happier and more energetic while you're alive, I guess. But I think I think yesterday's presentation had a lot. It's how we communicate to each other and to the public and to patients and policymakers, and communicating some of that uncertainty, which is an uncomfortable thing to talk about, but I think we do need to talk about it, because then when we have one study that shows one thing and another one that shows another, we don't look like, completely irresponsible. We don't know what we're doing. That's just science.
Could I say something about that? Yeah. This is interesting. This came up also over coffee before the session. A few years ago, we were fortunate to work with some authors speaking for what is like the largest world professional society of human stem cell researchers. I forget the name of the society. And what they were writing about is that their society decided, because of this very issue, they changed their formal standards of practice to include these sorts of things, by which it means, okay, it's not enough. We all know, we've all had our studies get misinterpreted by our university press office oftentimes. Even before let's not all blame the media. Oftentimes it's the people in your press office or the media or any place else, and suddenly you see this proliferation of advertisements for miracle stem cell cures, which are bogus. And they said, well, you know what? We don't have a silver bullet solution, but from now on, if you want to consider yourself like a member in good standing in this community, when you see this, you need to do something. And so we don't know, we're not telling you what it is, but you can't just sit there and wring your hands and complain and say, oh, shucks. So, that's not a silver bullet, like I said, but that is at least a step to say this is, by putting it on here, we can now start to attend to it and measure it and think about how to be better at it. So.
Want to start on that side? mic
Okay,
on
so
that
then
side.
Stefano.
We'll start on that side.
Maybe I can start. So a question. So my name is Stefan Erhardt. A question to the panel. So when you do get epidemiology papers, and we understand maybe we are not doing a good enough job of submitting them to your journals, but when you get them and they are rejected, which I think it happens at times. Can you pin down the reasons so in order to help us out? Are we not doing a good enough job of explaining why that is important? Are the methods opaque? Are the content areas not of interest? Is it not interesting enough for your audience? So what drives a rejection if it happens?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I was thinking about this a lot because one of the phrases that comes up often in editorial meetings, manuscript meetings, is the phrase basic epidemiology. And for some of the younger people in the room, basic, as we now know, has become sort of a pejorative. But I think the issue is that often you'll get papers that are simply showing an association. Perhaps it's never been demonstrated before, but it might be, out of a pool of, a handful of hospitals in Wales or something. And the lack of generalizability of a cohort like that, it could be an issue. But I think also at this stage, for like a Lancet paper, we really want it to have that second layer of impact. So is this generalizable? Do we have a complete set of data? Is this a Scandinavian registry data? And then this is the best evidence that we have that this association exists. So there's obviously different grades within that of how exciting something is, but I think a good sort of initial question is, have you sort of laid it out? It's also a great spot for all the more junior people. Cover letters matter, and your cover letter is your place to tell us why this is important and exciting, not necessarily to spin those results into the manuscript, but to tell us why this is a meaningful association and that you have used the most current methods to look at it, and this is how it sort of opens up this next field of questions. So I'll stop there and pass it. I'm sure you have.
I think it's very difficult to give an answer to this question because it depends so much on the paper. Like, we always take into consideration advance over previous work and potential impact for future work. And so both aspects can be in the approach or in the results. And so there's so many things that play into it that it's really difficult to give like a general response for me. It really, each paper is evaluated individually.
Yeah, thank you. That's sort of the million-dollar question that you asked, isn't it? I think I agree with everything that's been said, but also one thing it's probably the most obvious, but it's maybe a little bit more difficult to grasp, is that writing matters because it may be, you may have just unlocked the most transformational discovery in public health in the world, but if it's completely buried and uninterpretable in the writing, it's not going to get published, and that's just the frustrating thing. And so it's easier said than done to just say, oh, well, write better, but write better. There's this fine line. Don't bury the lead is one thing. Like, why do I have to read to page 10 to find out what you're talking about? And but you see where I'm going here. Like, writing, we do. Part of our job is to help find those hidden gems, and then to work with authors to help polish it. But there's only so much that you can do on the front end. Like, the raw material that comes in has to have some basic level of clarity and brevity, and telling you why it's worth reading.
I think a lot of it has to do with the question. I mean, we always say, Steve Goodman, who used to be in this department and is now at Stanford and is one of our statistical editors, say, if you put your hand over the conclusion and you don't, in the abstract, and you don't really care to take your hand off, then we shouldn't be spending any time on the paper. So I think one thing that's really important is articulating the question clearly. And the purpose of the study, if the purpose of the study is to explore, it's probably something we're not going to explore very long before the author gets a rejection letter. It has to be a well-articulated question, and then that question needs to be one that the audience for that journal, that's relevant to the audience for that journal. And I think that's the first step. If it's a great question and it's really relevant to our audience, we will spend the time to help with the writing. And I think that's the biggest thing. And then after that, it's, the other reason we choose not to reject papers that may have great questions that we want an answer to is that the methods are just unable to answer the question, and it's not something that you can fix with reanalysis. It's sort of integral in the study design, and it can't be fixed with revision and reanalysis.
Great. So I'd like to go back to the responsibility of journals, especially those that are affiliated with professional societies, to educate the media on the meaning of findings that come from epidemiologic studies. So what are the formal efforts that journals have to make sure that the media understands what is epidemiology, what is its value, and then related to that, whether there's a role for journals to help us brand our field, so the brand of epidemiology.
Thank you for that. Again, I can speak from my own experience in my own organization. Long before I was at Science Magazine, AAAS, our publisher, was kind enough to give me a fellowship and several other grad students and newly minted PhDs to go spend a summer. I worked in the newsroom at the LA Times when there was a lot of bloodletting and they were being bought by the Tribune Company. And my editor said, "Don't go into journalism." And so here I am. But AAAS has for many years a fellowship program to put scientists, to get them training in media, in journalism and writing. Some of them, if you guys ever listen to Joe Palca on NPR Science, he's an alumni. There's a lot of them alumni. We have a very, very sharp press office who leaps into action just whenever there are threats to scientific integrity in general. We issue, well, the magazine doesn't, but AAAS does. The magazine has a very sharp staff to promote the papers that we publish. So it helps get visibility to the topic among journalists, but also that press office works with authors and the editors to make sure that, every week I'm reading a press release that's being written about a paper, and every week I'm getting out the red pen to say, you can't say this, or you're missing the lead, put it up here. So to that level, we do have some formal, broader institutional efforts to work with the media. We actually AAAS just started an office actually in the past year that is sort of a go-to resource for journalists. So if you're researching a story and you say, I need an expert on X, AAAS has an office that has networks. So anyway, the organization and the journal have a lot of things out there in place to try and do exactly this. Does that mean that we've cracked the nut? Of course not. But.
Similarly, at Annals, we have a tip sheet that goes out to the media, and we spend a lot of time on tailoring, being sure those messages are careful and giving access to editors or the authors to help refine those messages. It helps, but once the journalists do their thing, it's out. It's hard to control. We also participate. PCORI does a course every year for journalists and about how to understand comparative effectiveness research. So I guess for about since PCORI has been doing that class, which is about 5 years, we have one of our senior editors go and teach a session in that course.
Hi. I'm Lori Dean. I'm an assistant professor in epidemiology. Two of the things that I've heard across all of the panelists was an emphasis on methods, as well as an emphasis, or I should say strong methods, and then an emphasis on impact and policy. And I also saw a lot of emphasis on quantitative methods. But I would argue that if you're interested, and especially in impact and being rigorous and robust, qualitative methods are also really important. And I asked this question because in 2016, BMJ categorically made an open declaration that they would no longer publish qualitative research. So my question is, how do you view mixed methods research, qualitative research, and what do you see as strong mixed methods and qualitative research that would be published in your journals?
So, I mean, Annals publishes some qualitative research, not a lot of it, but if qualitative methodology is the best way to answer the question or the most advanced way that is at the present, then we're very interested in it. If those questions are being, that area of research is at a stage where it's sort of beyond where qualitative research can help define the field, then we're less interested in it. And a lot of the qualitative research that we get is qualitative research that's done for the purpose of locally, an institution or a geographic entity locally solving a problem, and there's a concern about the applicability to other areas. So maybe very influential and important, but not big enough in scope where we think that it's going to be of interest to our readers. But it really has to do with sort of the area of inquiry and what does qualitative research have to contribute there. And then it's also following the Equator guidelines for the conduct and the reporting of qualitative research. And there are a lot of qualitative research. The investigators are not sophisticated enough, and really what they've just done is we talked to a couple of people and calling it qualitative research, but you really just talk to a couple of people.
Yeah, we would also, I don't know that I would say we welcome it. We definitely don't eschew it. It's not something that we would, desk reject. I've seen some that has probably gone to some of our daughter Cascade journals recently, but it's usually, as Christine was saying, complementary to other methods in there. So also from an editor perspective, it is super difficult to find qualified reviewers. So if it's a matter of resources and kind of where, sort of picking a tier of where you're going to send that work, that's also another consideration, is if they have sort of the expertise and the pool of reviewers where they could actually meaningfully review it.
Go to the right.
So in our breakout session, the topic of replication came out, and Rebecca was there. And I noticed reproducibility was also a highlighted topic from some of the presentations. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the value and the publishability of replicated studies. I think all of us believe that it's highly important for getting at the truth, but I'm certainly under the impression, I think it's a general impression, that studies that are just replications are not as appealing because of the lack of novelty. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think novelty weighs heavily, but there are areas where, we do, at least once during every manuscript conference, somebody says, yeah, but confirmatory research is really important because the last study didn't necessarily convince people. And so I think it's that, it has to do, again, back to the importance of the question and how certain are we of the answer. If we are pretty certain of the answer, then confirmatory research is going to be lower in priority, which doesn't mean it's not important, but it's lower in priority compared to the other things. And I think what people don't realize is that the editorial decisions we make are so important on what's what other papers are in the pipeline around that time. And there are papers that are great papers, but if they're coming in when we have a lot of really great papers, they're not, we don't, it's not implicit that we say we can only accept this many papers this week, but it just sort of, they rise and fall, to the bottom based on what's around. So one hint for young people in the room, at least at the clinical journals, our manuscript submissions go up around the winter holidays and in July and August. Why does that happen? All the professional meetings happen in the spring and in the fall. People present their work, they write up the papers, and then they're going on holiday and they want it, off their desk before they go away. So if you want a better chance, fight the urge, hold on to it for a while, and send it after those periods, because that's also the period where it's hardest to get reviewers, because everybody is taking time off. So, and the last 20 years at Annals, and I've talked to people at other clinical journals, it's unbelievable. Like, those spikes in submissions are so consistent.
Hi. Hi, thank you very much for the presentations, and this is incredibly valuable, especially as we expand our focus to additional journals. So maybe the question is more to science and nature communications. And I think I would note that I think Lancet has broadened its impact dramatically over the last decade into, this gets to the question to some extent is, you have audiences that you serve, and you have a perception of what they're interested in. But my impression is that over the last decade or two, Lancet has decided that its audience is very interested in public health type issues, and that public health, rather than being some audience editors may think is kind of boring, is kind of one of the most important parts of health. What's your perception of what excites your audiences, what would be attractive? And my biased perception maybe is that sometimes on the cover of things like Science are beautiful pictures. And maybe we need to make beautiful pictures of epidemiology rather than 2x2 tables, right? And with big data, et cetera, one can make beautiful pictures, and some of the omics data just have beautiful pictures, and I've been guilty of some of those things, and they haven't necessarily driven health, but they've been interesting. So comments about what would make our science more attractive, what is interesting, what's sexy?
I can lead up. So when reflecting on this, I always like to talk about the Lancet as a culture, because it really is. And in the same way that we have journals here represented that are published by societies, there is sort of a de facto Lancet society, and there definitely is an agenda there, and it is very much an agenda of social justice and trying to improve equity. So to that end, there is we are sort of recruiting things that are sort of confirmatory of our own worldview, and I think that Richard Horton was really instrumental in kind of shifting that focus to global health and the idea to do One Health, but I think you're onto something with making things more visual, and I think that we really could expand to do that. It's so difficult though, and I think the same topic in terms of communicating science came up in each of our groups independently, which is really fascinating. But is our visual abstracts a better way to communicate so that we can obviate some of these issues with media misrepresenting things that are difficult to convey? So I think that there's room to do both, and I think it's really exciting to have more broad multidisciplinary science journals picking up on this work too, because it really does get it out to a broader audience.
Yeah, I mean, we are not particularly worried about a certain audience because we try to serve the whole scientific community. So each field we're just trying to publish the best and most impactful work, and so I can't give you buzzwords for nature communications in total because it's so broad.
We have time for one.
Yeah, what they said.
Sorry.
A few of the, you've mentioned the potential impact, goal of the journal is impact on policymakers and the public. And so I think we're increasingly aware that both policymakers and the public consume information in very different ways than traditionally we've held as being impactful. So the metrics of impact based upon citations, for example, might really not be a future measure of impact. So I'm wondering about the role of social media and how you view the role from your journal's perspective and also from investigators' perspective for creating impact in our fields.
So at the journal, we try to do our best to promote the articles we publish on our Twitter account, and also each editor has their own Twitter account. So we are trying to promote the articles we publish and increase visibility in addition to press releases and things like that. So yes, we think social media plays a big role to make the science visible for other researchers and maybe also for the general public.
So Annals of Internal Medicine and the American College of Physicians are currently in a Twitter battle with the NRA, which I'm very proud of, that accused us of. So we have an initiative to publish research that's related to reducing firearm injury. And the NRA told us that doctors should stay in their lane. And so I think, that social media, and actually, we tweeted about the article, but it really was the NRA tweeting about it that created this huge awareness of what we've published, and that we published that work that would not have happened in the days before social media. So it really does magnify the messages. And I think that there's great benefit that comes with that, but there's also harm, and need to be careful. And I worry, we talk a lot about visual abstracts, but it's sort of a visual, the visual bite instead of a sound bite, and you really can sometimes not communicate the sort of the uncertainty and the caveats as well with those techniques, with those modes of communication.
I'd like to make just one final comment. I've had the pleasure in my scientific career to have been published in the Lancet, the Annals, Science, Nature Communications. And, as a scientist, it was like one of the proudest moments of my life to get that acceptance letter. Yet the citations didn't come through. My citations are gigantic in more specialty journals where people, the people I'm trying to reach read. But, we haven't had the same impact. And, you guys have incredible impact scores, but it didn't reach the epidemiology community. It sort of got lost. I'm not sure what the solution is, as I say to my colleagues here, it's fantastic to get published in PNAS or Cell or the Annals, but you may not end up reaching the audience, the influencers that you think you might be reading.
It depends on who you think the influencers are. So,
Exactly.
Our core audience at Annals, it goes much beyond the core, but it's the 160,000 members of the American College of Physicians, which are largely frontline clinicians. There are some researchers in there, but they're largely frontline clinicians. So I think the impact there is that they take the paper that you've published and they start incorporating that evidence into their practice. But they're not writing papers, so they're not going to cite it, but they may be using it. And I think the same way policymakers may be using it and considering it, but they're not citing it in research. So the citation statistics are really about how other researchers are using a piece of work. And there are many ways that people use evidence that doesn't end up in a citation. But we worry about the same thing because we know that one of the things that we do that attract good work is to have good citation metrics.
And again, I think that's a great question. It's a legitimate concern. But again, how do you define success? And we would firmly stand up and say, we don't define success by just appealing to your neighbors that you see at the conference every day anyway. Part of the success is, have you sprinkled some seeds of ideas into other disciplines via reading, people who read more broadly in a journal like us? Because people who study the sociology of science, you can look back and see, oh, it's when these disparate ideas come together, then boom, that's when you see big shifts in science. And one main way to do that is to put a physics paper beside an epidemiology paper, beside a computer science paper. And so, there's success there. It's not, I'm sorry that you didn't get the sites you wanted, but, don't cry too hard. You still did good. Yeah, great.
I was just going to say finally too, like with commissions or even, reflecting back on the Lancet, the Child Survival series, it was sort of the series that launched 1,000 ships. I don't know what the actual metrics for that paper or the series of papers or any of the individual papers are, but the cumulative effect on the policymaking world and how we've started to benchmark survival, it is, it's really difficult to quantify.
One thing, we had a little brief report that was written by one of our nephrology associate editor, where he tried to look at the clinical impact factor. So he's looking at the impact of journals by the traditional impact factor, and then looking at how often articles from that journal are cited in the resources that are used by frontline clinicians, so up to date. And it really did shift where, Annals went not all the way up to the top, but we were much more frequently, the work that we published was being cited in up to date, which is probably a better way of measuring, not a great way, but another way to measure clinical impact.
I think that's a great point to close on. I just want to take a moment to thank our panelists, not just for being here with us today, for really sharing insight with us on how we can continue to improve the way that we communicate our work, but also for the hard work that you all do. So thank you very much.